Thank you so much for coming. I'm very excited to be a part of Humanities Week. I'm a little nervous, so bear with me here. And I practiced this talk with my husband, and he said, whoa, that was a lot of information. So I hope that, take what you do, leave the parts that you're not interested in, that's fine. And if we don't have time for questions, which I do hope we have time for it, but if we don't, I'm certainly staying for the gelato, and I'm happy to talk to you and answer your questions over gelato. It's how I got most of my students to come to this talk today, was promise of gelato. So, as Dr. Welter said, I'm a linguist, and my research is very much filled with transcripts and translations, statistics, and spectrograms, and I think that's wildly fascinating, but I think it's not super engaging to people who are not linguists. So I was trying to refocus this talk to something that's a little more accessible to people who aren't as into that type of thing as I am. I wanted to give you an overview of the connection between culture and language, giving insight from my linguistic background. I'm fortunate to be able to teach a class on my field of research, Japanese gender and language, with a focus mainly on women. And I thought that today I would introduce you to some of the more surprising aspects of female gender and language in Japan. So we'll look at the history, how it's changed, where it's ended up, sort of a whirlwind tour of Japanese gender through the ages. I mean, it's actually really a whirlwind tour, so hang on, I guess, I don't know. I'll provide you with data from linguistic studies showing how Japanese culture and language have changed for Japanese women. You're going to see a lot of Japanese text, and I assume most of you don't speak Japanese, but that's okay. I'm going to walk you through it, and I'll point to the key elements, and I've color-coded most of it, so I think that's going to help as well. Gender is especially interesting to me because it's socially constructed and it's culturally specific. So what's considered feminine in one culture is quite different from what might be considered feminine in another culture. And even in one single society, the concept of femininity can and likely does change over time. Japanese women especially seem to embody a specific type of femininity. When I question my students about stereotypes of Japanese women, they inevitably give the following as examples. So the traditional kimono-clad woman is probably the first thing that pops into your mind when you think about Japanese women. Mainly the courtesan, like you might read about in old Japanese literature, but also the geisha, of course, or just a woman dressed in, oops, too fast. A woman dressed in traditional clothes doing something traditional like tea ceremony. The Japanese schoolgirl, or the anime version of schoolgirl, most of my students really love anime, so that's the examples they always bring up to me. Usually, this type of femininity is represented as juvenile, cutesy, but she's very girly. Whoa, I'm not doing this. Okay, very girly, and she's easily identified by her schoolgirl uniform. You can see them all over Tokyo. The mother, dedicated to caring for her children and her family, she's typically a full-time housewife focusing on childcare and housework until the kids are older, at which point she might go back to a non-skilled job, or she might take up some traditional pastimes like flower arranging or tea ceremony. And then the Harajuku girl. So now this is the name of Gwen Stefani's backup dancers. I don't know how many of you are familiar with those. It's not what I'm talking about here. As Dr. Welter talked about, Harajuku is an area of Tokyo that's known for its unique fashion style. You have some examples here on the screen. Mainly it's women in their teens and 20s. These girls push the norms of fashion. They oftentimes embrace styles from anime and manga. So they do cosplay, which is costume play. They take characters from these anime and they dress up like them. And they integrate a cute style into their clothing and demeanor. So they're sort of moving away from the traditional, sort of pushing it. These all represent different aspects of femininity in Japan. Even the Harajuku girl, she's innovative and deviant in fashion, but I'm not sure why this is going like that. She's innovative and deviant in her fashion, but she's not rejecting femininity per se. She's reinterpreting it to embrace perhaps a cute or a juvenile side to it. And as we'll see in a bit, the Harajuku girl is actually viewed as a very feminine persona. When asked for characteristics that define Japanese women, students say that they're nurturing, cute, polite, beautiful, gentle, and empathetic. It turns out that the Japanese themselves have similar ideas of the ideological Japanese woman. Contemporary positive characteristics, I'm not quite sure what's going on with the computer. Contemporary positive, actually I think I'm just gonna, sorry. I'll go old school and use my finger. All right, contemporary positive characteristics for Japanese women include being dependent, emotional, romantic, cute, tender, submissive, and cheerful. And one of my friends, when she saw this, she really bristled at submissive, but it's something that gets included in these discussions. In contrast to this, traits that are considered as expressions of masculinity are things like intelligence, the ability to think, plan, and control, courage, and even violence. So you can see a big disconnect between the two sides. Two researchers, Sugihara and Katsurada, conducted an extensive survey of Japanese college students to pinpoint what traits define the ideal Japanese man and the ideal Japanese woman. The traits deemed most desirable for women included those you see on the screen: affectionate, eager to soothe hurt feelings, tender, loves children, gentle, cheerful, and soft-spoken. The ideal woman is also defined by what she's not, namely many of the traits that are deemed to be the most masculine. So the ideal woman should not be assertive, she shouldn't have a strong personality, be forceful, willing to take risks, competitive, or ambitious. It's giving you this nice picture. The stereotypes of my students and Japanese college students actually mesh pretty well, and they seem centered on traits that relate closely with motherhood. Okay, so it wasn't that, it's just the computer. Traits related to motherhood, physical attractiveness, and many of these traits, such as being gentle or soft-spoken, or not being assertive or forceful, highlight gendered language norms for women, or what's been called Japanese women's language. Assumptions about Japanese women's language, like women speak more politely and women cannot speak logically, are often heard in Japan. Prescriptive differences in Japanese language for men and women are said to include terms of address, such as first and second person pronouns, so the words you use for I versus you. Sentence final endings used to add extra information at the end of sentences, like emphasis, hesitation, or emotion. There's one specific prefix for nouns that's supposed to make them sound more beautiful. That's something that, of course, women are supposed to do. And there's a clear expectation that women should use more honorific language than men. They should be more polite, more formal. They should use language that's indirect and non-assertive. And overall, they should be more empathetic and soft-spoken in the language they use. One specific example of this is how men and women use directives differently. Women have been shown to phrase their directives more like requests, so you ask someone to do something for you, and men tend to use more command or imperative forms, so you give orders to people. I'm going to show you examples of how language might differ if spoken by a man versus a woman. Even if you don't know Japanese, it's totally fine. I color-coded it so you can see the blue pieces are masculine, the red pieces are feminine, and you'll see which parts differ in terms of these gendered language use. Both speakers are uttering different versions of the phrase, I made it up, so bear with me. Yesterday I ate the lunchbox my friend made for me. It was delicious. First you're going to hear the female voice, and then you will hear the male voice.
昨日私、お友達が作ってくださったお弁当を食べたの。美味しかったわよ。
昨日俺、友達が作ってくれた弁当を食ったんだ。うまかったぜ。
It's constructed language, but my Japanese friend said, yeah, that sounds good. All right. Okay. So you can see the example on the board now written in romanization. We see gendered language differences across many features. The different words used for I by the male and the female voices, the more beautiful version of nouns spoken by the woman, the different verbs or nouns for the same meaning, the male versions are maybe more crude, and the different sentence endings that index gender. So you can see those down here. When in Japan in the 80s and 90s, I was struck very much by the extremely high-pitched voices of women working in stores and the women you saw on TV, and the women who worked on elevators that I couldn't find a good example of, though I wanted it. This is something many foreigners notice and inevitably comment on. So, I have an example of it, but obviously, in general, women have higher voices than men do. But Japanese women in particular have a higher pitch than women from America or other cultures. This has been studied and documented. This soft and high tone of voice is reported to be a feature of Japanese women's
そうで
language.
すね。これ今回
Okay, my computer's going crazy. Give me 1 second. I think I'm going to do this a different way so we don't have to keep doing this. I apologize. Okay, here we go. I'm going to show you an excerpt of an interview with Kyari Pamu Pamu. Do you guys know her? I don't know. Perhaps the most well-known Harajuku girl today. So we're coming right back around to Harajuku girl. You can certainly listen to her voice, but notice a lot of other aspects of femininity that she embodies. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. So what did you think? Yeah, high-pitched. She has a fairly typical high-pitched, extremely feminine-sounding voice to Japanese ears. It's something that's taken differently in different cultures, though. You can also see the importance of pitch and views of femininity in the following commercial. Pay particular attention to the voices. And I'm going to warn you that the subtitles, I pulled this right off YouTube. The subtitles are not mine. They're kind of off in places. But you'll get the gist of what the commercial means. I love that commercial. So, having a higher pleasing pitch to the voice, one that sounds extremely feminine, is presented here as being more important than physical attractiveness. Though, for the record, I thought that girl was adorable, so. Some of these aspects of gendered language are directly taught to children, and deviations by children are going to be pointed out and corrected. For example, young girls who have older brothers might begin using the masculine version of I that they hear their older brothers using, and they just mimic their older brothers. Parents might tell them specifically not to use that form, that they should use the feminine form instead. Others are probably acquired through the natural process of children observing and mimicking adult language of adults that they identify with. Certainly exposure to media reinforces these things, as children watching something like this commercial are going to get a clear picture of what's considered attractive and feminine. This is such an integral part of Japanese language that many gender differences are even explicitly taught in Japanese language classrooms for foreigners. We include some in the textbooks we use as well. Regardless of how it's learned, this woman's language is strongly felt to be a core part of the modern Japanese language. One researcher has called it a socially powerful truth and an unavoidable part of practical social knowledge in contemporary Japan. So it's not something you can just ignore. I'll now show some quotes that highlight what Japanese linguists have said about women's language in the past. So in 1929, women's speech is characterized by elegance, that is, gentleness and beauty. Moreover, such characteristics correspond with our unique national language. In 1942, Japanese womanhood is now being recognized as beautiful and excellent beyond compare with the other womanhoods of the world. Likewise, Japanese women's language is so good that it seems to me that it is, along with Japanese womanhood, unique in the world. And in 1969, we cannot hope for contemporary Japanese women to be as witty and tactful as were those in the past. But at least I would like them to have a sincere and humble attitude and to preserve this cultural heritage passed down from the ancestors without destroying it. These would lead you to believe that women's language is something well established and a part of the long-standing traditions and cultures of Japan, passed on from generation to generation. However, the origin of modern Japanese women's language can be found in the Meiji Era. It's only 2 centuries ago, and reinforced through both the Taisho and the Showa eras. I'll now highlight the role of women in the Japanese era as shown on the screen. In the Meiji Era, there were three main ways through which a redefinition of the women's role was established. First, the government redefined the role of women. The Meiji Constitution of 1890 stated for the first time that only male heirs could succeed to the throne. The Meiji Civil Code of 1898 legally subordinated women to men. Wives now needed permission from their husbands to enter into legal contracts. In the case of a divorce, the husband got custody of the children, and a wife's adultery, not a husband's, was grounds for divorce. The Imperial Rescript on Education in 1890 upheld a view of a state based on hierarchy and obedience with expectations placed on women to enact a specific domestic role that supported the government. Second, the government mandated compulsory education for all primary school children, both male and female. Compulsory education was one way that the government could disseminate the new gender ideology, including language use, which we'll talk about, throughout Japan. For girls, this compulsory education meant emphasis on homemaking, modesty, high morality, and obedience to fathers and husbands. Certainly, the curriculum for girls differed from that for boys, as the girls were only supposed to receive as much education as was necessary so that they could enact their role properly in the domestic sphere. They were not going on to further education. In terms of their duty to the state, education for women was explicitly designed to prepare them to become ryosai kenbo, the good wife and wise mother. This restricted the role of girls and women primarily to the home and family. In terms of their duty to the state, women were supposed to serve their men and families, and to bear children who would support the nation at war. The first Minister of Education in 1887 argued that it was women's education that was actually the basis of the success or failure of the nation. It's heavy stuff. So he said, the models for women are a mother nurturing her child, a mother teaching her child, her son coming of age and being conscripted to go to war and leave his mother with a goodbye, a son fighting bravely on the battlefield, and a mother receiving a telegram informing of her son's death in the war. Here we can clearly see the roles defined by the government for women throughout their lives. Women were to produce and raise boys to fight for the nation. And under the Japanese constitutional system, these notions of a gendered hierarchy within the family were made explicit. This is one aspect of Libra's concept of sexual polarization, role specialization, which assigns women to the domestic domain and men to the public domain. So there's a clear separation here. Third, the government sought to standardize Japanese and make it compulsory in schools. The first aspect of this I'm not going to talk too much about, but it was adapting the written language so it more closely represented the language being spoken. Previous to this, there was literary Japanese and then the vernacular that was spoken. Along with this, which was more important, was standardizing the Japanese spoken throughout the nation. Until this point, different areas of Japan spoke different dialects, and oftentimes these dialects were incomprehensible to each other. So if you went far enough, you wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. The new standard Japanese was based on a form of Tokyo Japanese. So many students were in effect learning an entirely new language. And along with it, these new gendered forms that were dictated by the government. As one researcher argued, this newly developed linguistic consciousness was both the instrument and the critical location of the birth of Japanese women's language. And it was the ideal situation to implement standardized women's language throughout Japan. I'd like to step back for a minute because it's very important to note that previous to this, in the Tokugawa era, much of what we believe to be firmly in the Japanese women's sphere, such as raising children and taking care of the family, wasn't the main role of women at all. In the Tokugawa period, though all women were expected to marry, childbearing wasn't necessarily a woman's primary obligation. Everyone in the household participated in all the tasks necessary for running it. In the absence of an appropriate male head of the family, a woman could take charge. And in fact, the ideology of the time stated that young mothers shouldn't even be involved in their children's upbringing because either they had questionable morals because they're young, so they don't know any better, or they were likely to spoil their own children. So somebody else was supposed to raise their children if they had any. Fathers played an important role too. They took a lead in education and the physical care of their children at the time, showing that it's not the women's sole responsibility. In fact, women didn't actually have to have children at all at this time. Sons, sons-in-law, married couples could all be adopted by families to guarantee passing on the family line. You could also designate women as heirs at this time. Women in this era were valued as workers, wives, and daughters-in-law. There was less of a focus on their role as mothers. So all of the stuff we had just talked about, the redefined role for women in the Meiji Era, was a marked change from what had been previously accepted. The shift in gender role expectations is, I think, clear. I hope clear, yes. But what did all of these changes actually affect? How did all these changes actually affect the language, especially related to women's language? Inoue examined two novels, one from before these changes took place and one from after they had been established. This chart shows a sampling of sentence final endings used by characters in each of these novels. It indicates what type of speakers were using these endings. So B indicates that the sentence final ending was used by both male and female, F by female only, and M by male only. Of the sentence final endings provided, the earlier novel from 1813 that you see on the right showed no separation according to gender. The only limitation apparent is that perhaps a certain class of women couldn't use that sentence final ending. In the later novel from 1909, these same sentence final endings shifted from neutral to a polarized male-female usage. Though this is actually not a record of how people were going around speaking at the time, it shows how novelists were representing male and female speech. And that's yet another way these gendered norms were being disseminated. I'd also like to point out, because it comes in later, that those marked here with an asterisk, those are considered today to be very feminine forms, and you'll actually see some of those on later slides of modern women's language. The reinforcement of standardized women's language continued through World War II in the Showa era. In 1941, the Ministry of Education released The Essentials of Etiquette, the Reiho Yoko. This was a textbook for schools which prescribed in detail the speech style appropriate for women, including more polite and humble expressions than required by men, in addition to some of those things we just saw on the previous slide. Councils, such as the National Language Association, were formed to promote correct language usage, certainly including promoting correct female speech. This group even had female members who served as linguistic role models for other women. Washi argued it wasn't until around this time that women's language actually started to gain currency. Up to this point, despite the compulsory education and the compulsory use of standard Japanese in schools, only a small part of the population actually spoke standard Japanese. I think she said it was somewhere around 20%. And therefore, a very small part of the population spoke women's language. But these moves to promote standard Japanese, including this mostly artificial construct of women's language, started to take hold and spread at this time. In modern times, the hegemonic ideology of Japanese women certainly includes the personality traits that stem from the good wife, wise mother role established in the late 1800s. But it also still emphasizes the appropriate ideological language use, so using women's language. Even in contemporary Japan, we read about the important role of the mother in her children's educational success. There's a continued focus on being a good mom. Even though the pervasive slogan of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, has mostly fallen out of use, the influence of it still affects women today. One person I interviewed for my research actually described her mother in a positive light as the typical good wife and wise mother of her generation. She graduated from college, she got married, and she dedicated herself to her family and her husband full time. So let's consider a little bit the role of mothers in society today. Perhaps one of the biggest symbols of being a good mother in Japan is the lunchbox. In fact, when I did a Google search in Japanese looking for pictures for the good mother slide, half the pictures that came up were of lunchboxes like these. I'm seriously lucky if I can get my child fed. I can't make things that look like this. So they're creative, they're filled with popular characters, they include all the nutritional pieces so they pass inspection at school. I mean, it's a big undertaking. The pictures on this slide, it gets worse for me, because the pictures on this slide are some my friend posted on her Facebook page of the special lunch boxes she makes for her daughter once a week for Character Lunchbox Day. So when I went to take them, to put them in my presentation, I started reading the comments closely that her friends were posting on these pictures. And it provided insight for me into the importance of this type of behavior for mothers in Japanese society. Many of her friends were talking about how happy this is going to make her adorable daughter, Chi, when she opens this lunchbox at school. So she's emotionally nurturing her child as well as physically nurturing her. My friend reported that her friends praise her all the time for being such a good mom because she makes these character lunchboxes. They ask her for advice on how they can also do this for their children. And these comment areas seem to be a space where mainly these women who are mothers, the rest of us just like them, we don't say anything, but it's mainly the mothers that are discussing the how-to of it. It's a space where they share and explore this aspect of motherhood. One commenter even wrote the comment, "Dynamic Dawa," and it means something like how colorful. But what was most striking to me about this comment was the participant used the super feminine ending wa at the end of it. To me, this reinforced her femininity while discussing something that's clearly an important part of motherhood. And I thought it's possible she also felt a little threatened because she wasn't measuring up, and it was like, I'm a woman too, wa. And I did a little Facebook stalking, I can't lie. In comments by the same person on other non-motherhood related posts, she uses neutral equivalents. She's not putting her femininity out there when she's interacting. By the way, I did check these just this weekend, and my friend, the last comment she posted was how happy she was that the super typhoon was hitting and school was canceled, so she didn't have to make a character bento this week. For me, that really brought home how much pressure she and other mothers are in. They're competing with each other about their children's lunch boxes. Another important aspect of motherhood that was reported to me was breastfeeding. There's a lot of pressure on Japanese mothers to breastfeed for about a year, but there's very little in place to support them if they are at work and breastfeeding. So, in other words, it'd be almost impossible for a woman to both work outside the home and continue to breastfeed her child. Therefore, these aspects of being a good mother, as defined by society, require a mother to focus solely on that, on being a wife and a mother. A woman has to choose between a career outside the home or a family, in many cases. Maybe what defines a mother as good and wise has changed, but women are still being judged by peers in society based on the same premise. As with the Meiji Era, the state today is concerned with women's accountability in marriage and birth rates. As you can see, the birth rate's been steadily declining since the 50s. It's currently at 1.4, and the population of Japan is projected to shrink by 1/3 by the year 2060. Since the mid-1970s, there's been an increased delay in marriage and also in the age that women give birth. So the average age of marriage has increased by 6 years from the 50s, from the age of 23 to 29.3. And the average age women give birth to their first child has increased by 5 years since the 70s. So from 25.6 to 30.4. And that's the first child that they have. More and more women are pursuing careers or opportunities outside of the domestic sphere. And as I said, society is not currently set up to enable women to easily juggle both. One woman I interviewed said that she had no interest in getting married. She was in her late 20s at the time, and she's still not married, and that was a while ago, because there were too many fun things to do. She thought marriage would force her to focus on taking care of the household and her husband and any future kids they have, and that would limit her time to pursue her own interests. With the decreasing birth rate and the resulting social issues, such as a quickly aging population, which you can see here on the slide, shows you the distribution of how many people are at that age, so it's getting fat on the top instead of fat on the bottom. And the issue of dwindling pension funds to support this aging population, the pressure on women to marry and have more children earlier is said to have increased. Former Prime Minister Modi was even quoted as saying that women who do not have children don't deserve pensions. Oh, it gets worse. It's truly strange to say that we have to use tax money to take care of women who don't even give birth once, who grow old living their lives selfishly. Let's all boo him. No. It's important to note here, though, that the focus and blame is placed where? On the women, right? Not the man. Nobody's saying anything about men who haven't had kids. Men are expected to contribute to the pension by working and paying into it. And women are supposed to contribute by producing more workers who will then pay into the pension. Once again here, we have an example of Libra's concept of role specialization. The women clearly are only supposed to be in the domestic sphere and the men in the public sphere. These ideologies can also be seen in school children today. Before I show you my next example, I just want to remind you of the gender ideologies from the Meiji Era. So boys were raised to be active, brave, and strong, and they're supposed to go off and fight for Japan. And girls are raised to be obedient, polite, and non-argumentative, and don't forget, good wife and wise mother. Recently, a former student of mine who's teaching English in Japan in Japanese public schools was, she was complaining pretty much about the traditional Japanese gender roles still apparent in her students. She had asked them to write an English writing exercise about their dream. They could write about anything they wanted. There were no limitations. And she sent me the two that really stood out to her. The first is written by a 15-year-old girl. I know it's hard to see, but her dream is to be a bride. And let's be honest, I think she has a vocabulary problem and means wife here. So her dream's to be a wife. She wants to create a warm family and have a fulfilling life by caring for her family and doing housework, which she's currently practicing at home with her mother. The next one was written by a 15-year-old boy. His dream is to develop tanks. He wants to defend and protect Japan, to build a great military force, and to do so, he will achieve this goal by studying hard. So, this looks like Meiji Era Japan when I read these, which is why I was like, can I have these? Can I have these for my talk? The teacher reported that one of the schools she teaches at is a farming fishing high school, so a lot more traditional, and that these are the types of things she hears from the students all the time. These clearly reflect the ideals put out there by the Meiji government, showing that they're still salient today. But what about the ideology of language? There are periodically letters published that reflect similar complaints as the one voiced in this excerpt from a 59-year-old man to the Asahi newspaper in the early 90s. I felt a mother or female professor using so-called masculine language was deplorable, and I questioned her educational level. In Japan, there's an attractive and adorable women's language. Opinion polls are commonly conducted on whether women's language is becoming corrupted and how much so. And a search on Amazon Japan for how to speak brings up what seems like an endless list of books on the proper way to speak, use honorifics, and the use of appropriate gendered language, showing there's a clear market for such books. All three of these books were targeted towards women specifically, and I did not have to look hard to find books like this. So the yellow book, the one on the right, is titled, and I'm not good at coming up with fancy translations, but titled something like The New Rules for How a Female Professional Should Speak. And if you read the description, the teaser at the bottom, it's intelligent and pleasant communication. This book was interesting to me because it's not talking about how women should be a tough or aggressive negotiator, something you might see books geared towards professional women in America writing about, but how you should be a pleasant communicator. The one in the middle, the blue and pink book, is titled The Speaking Style of Intelligent Women and Stupid Women. At the bottom here, it says, immediate results, language beauty. Your likability will rapidly increase. The magic of changing the way to express the same thing. And they give some examples. Previously, you might have said, did you lose some weight? And now you would say, you look more slender than ever. Or before, that's cheap. Now it would be, that's very reasonable. So you have to change the way you speak, obviously. The orange and white one on the right, become a cool adult woman, lessons in speaking. And the description in the bottom, your beauty is wasted if you cannot speak well. Changing the tone of your voice and use of vocabulary will turn you into an attractive woman. That one, I think it speaks for itself. There's not much I have to say on that one. It's apparent, though, that this gendered language ideology still resonates with Japanese society today. At least the expectation is there that women should follow the ideology, and that it's related to their success in business and whether they're viewed as attractive or not. However, my students inevitably bring up animation to me. And they say, but we watch animation and the female characters we see in animation don't do these things. They don't conform to what we're told we have to do. So animation. So I have a clip that shows two different types of Japanese animated women. A very feminine woman who embodies all the characteristics we're talking about, and a masculine language-using tomboy who rejects all of them. My students sent me this too. So I did a mini linguistic analysis of it. I won't get into details. But in appearance, action, and behavior, there's a clear separation between the two female characters. Hiyori, on the left here, is presented as very masculine, standing with her arms spread, using masculine gestures, unkempt, in a tracksuit. Not to mention she's walking around carrying a sword. Orihime, on the right, is in the Japanese schoolgirl uniform that indexes femininity. She's demure, she's well-groomed. And the language difference here is very marked as well. Though Orihime doesn't speak much in this clip, she uses standard Japanese. She has a high-pitched, breathy voice, very breathy voice, and she uses feminine endings on her sentences. Hiyori, on the other hand, has low pitch. She speaks dialect. Throughout her speech, she employs masculine language, including the Yakuza-style rolling of the R's, which I'm not going to do right now, but you heard it in the clip. She uses profanity, masculine sentence endings like zo, and strong imperative forms. Remember, that was a feature of masculine speech. This character is rejecting much of what defines Japanese femininity. She's assertive, dominant, direct, powerful, and masculine, as indicated by her appearance, action, and language choices. This doesn't mean, however, and I have to reinforce this to my students, that it's acceptable for women to go to Japan and speak like this. But I would like to note that my Japanese graduate students indicated that they did know girls who talked like this, so it's not that it's unheard of. But the expectation is still there that women are going to speak like the female character. So current linguists have been moving more and more away from documenting standard women's language, which outlines the ideologies and accepted norms that we've talked about, and looking at case studies to see what's done by actual modern Japanese women. I'm going to wrap up by highlighting a few of these cases to show you the range of actual women's language that's being used today. And if we have time, tell you a little bit about my research, and then we can eat the gelato that's distracting me right now. Okay, the first example. Miyazaki examined the range of first-person pronouns used by girls in a Japanese high school, so seventh grade. You can see in the chart at the top up here what the textbook rules are for what version of I to use. The students would be using what's in the red box. So girls should use only atashi or watashi in all cases. No girl in the study regularly used watashi. They thought it was too formal and they used it in their school writing. Some did use atashi, but many also used boku and some even used ore. Many girls also used this to the area new pronoun uchi. And interestingly, their mothers, when asked, didn't even know the girls were using this pronoun and had never actually heard it. As the lower diagram shows, so this is the ideologies put out there by linguists, and this is the students' interpretations of them. So they're pretty much the same, but we see that they placed ore much further down on the masculine scale. So they view it as much more masculine than boku. This chart shows each small circle is an individual student, and for the most case, a girl. And so you can see the range of pronouns, first-person pronouns they were using. We have uchi, atashi, uchi, and then this group up here, we have ore, boku. So it's a range we clearly see. Generally, the girls' usage of the masculine pronouns was accepted by their peers, but with laughter. So if they used boku or ore, they're kind of like, oh, those girls, you know. But they were actively discouraged against doing this by their teachers and parents. One girl even said that she uses ore at school. She would never use it at home because her mother would be horrified by her language. So she hid that from her mother. It's been argued by quite a few linguists that when women use these deviant forms, it's actually a form of young people's speech, so they'd grow out of it later. In this case, the argument would be that these girls are using the non-standard pronouns as a way to explore their gendered identity and their place within their relatively small society of school, and that they'd begin using the ideological women's language when they became full-fledged members of society after they graduated. In this case, it's pretty clear that the girls were able to experiment with rejecting the ideologies because they had the support of their peer groups. So the larger broken circles show you who was friends with who, like who was hanging out together. And you can see the atashi uchi girls hung out together and the boku ore girls hung out together for the most part, not 100%. So remember that the mothers didn't even know the girls were using uchi, and the one girl specifically said that she'd use forms at school that she wouldn't use at home. This shows that these girls know what's expected of them. They know what the ideologies are, and that when they don't have their peer support, they choose the path of least resistance and just go with what they should be using. It also highlights the social pressure involved in making language choices. The next example. Matsumoto looked at the speech of middle-aged, middle-class Japanese stay-at-home mothers. So the group that's supposed to be the quintessential ideal Japanese woman. This is the one who should be exhibiting the ideological women's language. On this slide, I just took a small example from her larger study. And we see a conversation between three women, three stay-at-home moms. The single underlines indicate forceful stance, or what's classified as masculine, and the double underlines indicate delicate stance. Over here we have the English, and this is the Japanese. It's lined up perfectly, and the red arrows are just taking you to where the most important lines are. So I want to call your attention to speaker M, and she's the one marked with the red arrows. You can see that within the speech of speaker M, she's shifting freely between the masculine and the feminine styles. So she's not entirely rejecting it, but she's also not embracing what you expect her to do, which is the feminine language. Matsumoto argued that it's likely that these mothers, like speaker M, were motivated by the desire to portray themselves alternatively as anti-conformists, or the cutting-edge moms, by using the masculine style, and traditional or classy by using the more feminine style. Matsugo examined a conversation between a mother and a daughter. In this conversation, they've been discussing a famous person who recently passed away. Both mother and daughter in the larger conversation this was pulled from mainly used non-gendered forms, but the mother did also use occasional feminine forms, and the case I'm going to show you is the only time the daughter used a feminine form. So in this excerpt that I have up here, in this one case, the daughter appears to feel threatened by the mother questioning her. So in line 30, the mother said, "Anata mo shiteru nante omou wanakatta wa." I didn't think that you would know him too. She found this threatening. She exhibits her displeasure by pulling a card from her mother's linguistic playing deck using an extremely feminine form. I view it as she's throwing it back in her mother's face. So in line 36 over here, she says, "Shiteru wa yo, sore gurai." So of course I know that much. The mother herself used the feminine form when she questioned her daughter. This form generally indicates mild emphasis, and it's not at all in itself aggressive. But more than half the times the mother used similar forms previously in this recording, it was being used as a strong assertion marker. Therefore, her daughter likely took it to be the same in this case. She also likely took it to be negative based on her subsequent responses. Matsugo decided that the way the daughter interpreted this could be translated as, "I didn't know somebody like you was sophisticated enough to know this person." And her reaction sort of pretty much supports that. The daughter expresses her displeasure by saying both in line 39, "You have no manners," to her mother, and then "rude." She also raised her voice and just generally had an angry tone to her voice. Matsugo argued that the daughter's marked use of a form that her mother commonly uses in this instance was a way to effectively express and assert herself in this interaction on the same level or status. So she defined herself using this feminine form, wayo, as a woman and an adult, as well as sophisticated. In this case, the use of the feminine marker is not to soften the language, but to assert aggression and displeasure, things that we see are not ideologically feminine. In my own research, I interviewed both Japanese lesbian and bisexual women and heterosexual women, and I was looking for differences in the usage of this ideological feminine speech to see how a speaker could express a gendered persona by manipulating these forms. Which forms do you choose to use? Which forms do you choose to avoid? Lesbians were more likely to use masculine forms. Here we see a chart of the distribution of pronouns. Heterosexual women almost never used masculine pronouns. There was one speaker who used one token. It could have been an anomaly, but we see predominantly they're using the feminine forms. Lesbian bisexual speakers showed a slight preference for masculine forms, but generally they were split pretty evenly between the two categories. There were examples of women purposely using certain forms to project or hide an identity. One lesbian speaker, when asked how she might hide her sexuality, used the feminine pronoun atashi as part of quotations of what she might say to somebody who was asking her. So I'm going to skip the Japanese and just read the English. So when everybody starts talking about guys, I try saying things like, "This is my type." And if asked what my boyfriend does, it's actually my girlfriend, but I say things like, "Well, my boyfriend," So in addition to the misdirection of using general terms like type or flat out saying boyfriend when she means girlfriend, she's also in these quotes using the feminine pronoun atashi, which could be a way of her sort of highlighting the feminine side and rejecting the sexuality or the masculine side to her persona. One heterosexual speaker stated that she used boku in school to place herself on the same level as her male peers. It seems that she felt that if she used feminine language, she'd be viewed as intellectually weaker. One question I asked all of my interviewees was if they'd ever had a crush on or admire a girl. Whether they were lesbian or straight, I asked them this. One of the heterosexual speakers responded with, for example, if her clothes are always cute and I think, oh, she's always wearing a cute style, Dawa, super feminine, I think about copying it, that kind of thing, I guess. The use of the extremely feminine ending here could be a subconscious effort to reinforce her femininity to me when she thought she was being challenged as to whether she'd had deeper interests in women, which was not what I was doing. A way to say, I'm not interested in women, I'm not a lesbian. Look, I'm feminine. But once again, we see that the ideologies attached to women are still salient in modern Japan. One of my lesbian interviewees said the following in response to the question, what is femininity? I've marked the sections indicating femininity in red, so they're easier to see, and I've left out the original Japanese because this one's long. What is feminine, I wonder? Generally things like language use and occupation. Language use and how they move, that sort of thing. Like not using masculine language. This girl who I thought was extremely feminine, when I said, this cup is cute, right? Everyone else said, it's cute, isn't it? But she said, it's so cute, feminine ending. I thought, isn't she adorable? And my heart started pounding. As for a feminine girl, it's probably this sort of thing, and also things like her voice when she's surprised. And I asked for clarification, and she said, I can't do it. I've never done it. So here we see her touch on a variety of aspects of Japanese femininity, but explicitly talk about language. A very feminine woman would use the ideological feminine language and also high-pitched voice we discussed at the beginning. One which this woman who doesn't embrace that ideology has said she never does. So in conclusion, even in the modern examples we looked at where women were not exhibiting the ideological women's language, we can still see that it's a salient category. These women are utilizing or rejecting it for specific purposes. Considering the ideology is important as it gives us invaluable insight into the expectations placed on women and how they manipulate these norms to express a particular gendered identity. It's clear that there's a feminine language and clearly defined expected feminine roles still apparent today. Though this gendered language was constructed and disseminated by the Meiji and Showa governments as one way to reinforce a gendered hierarchy, one that places women in the domestic sphere and responsible for the family and child rearing, aspects of it remain strongly rooted in modern society. Children may learn what types of language are socially appropriate, but they have the power to manipulate these norms to their own purpose. This was just a brief glimpse at women in Japan and how their roles and language have changed and not changed over time. Of course, we can't generalize about all women at any point in history. I'll leave you with the words of Gail Bernstein, who said about Japanese women in history, gender has been continuously recreated. The difference between an upper-class woman, a merchant woman, and a female servant in a wealthy farm family were worlds apart in terms of work, clothing, and norms of behavior. I think the same can be said of modern Japanese women who find themselves trying to balance being a part of both the domestic and the public sphere and the ideologies and expectations that go along with both. Thank you very much.